Russell Raymond. Wait, Raymond? Among the crowd of people, the guards were checking the identity of one man and were genuinely surprised to see this name. One of the guards looked at him and wondered if Raymond was not the name of the founding family. Russell Raymond is an aristocrat. However, they did not understand what had happened to his clothes, why they were in such a terrible state. The guard told him that the inspection was over and he could go on. The second guard turned to the man and asked his colleague if he knew him, to which he said that he was a Raymond, a descendant of the founders themselves. The man was very surprised and asked why he looked so bad. He is an aristocrat, so why does he dress so badly? Maybe it means that the founding family is not as authoritative as it used to be. Another guard said that it looks like he even heard that the White Tower is now looking for mercenaries. I wonder what he could be doing here. Another objected and said that he wasn't even a Christian. Why would he want to become a mercenary? At this time, the guy was walking on, but he still heard their conversations. He just smiled and thought they had too many stupid questions. He stood in front of the capital, Camelot, looking around him. He walked to the magical White Tower, the place where all the guards of the kingdom were. He looked up at it and thought that he had once worked hard to get there, to prevent the downfall of his family. After his father was killed in a hellish battle against the Empire, they had to flee the castle in a hurry. They had to get into the magic tower to regain and restore their territories. A little boy with tears in his eyes shouted not to be taken away from his mother. A ring was dangling from a chain around his neck. Their wishes were just not a real dream. He was expelled from the academy before he even had a chance to climb the tower. Russell, who stood with his head bowed, was told that he had received 3 bad grades. The man told the boy that this was the first time this had happened in the history of the entire academy. He could do better in theory, but he would definitely not be able to make it to the second round. It would be difficult for him to endure the narrowing of his mana powers, and the man asked him if he should consider some other profession. Raymond clutched his chest and replayed the words about the narrowing of mana powers in his head, because these threads have been weak and thin since he was born. He couldn't take in an unlimited amount of mana, but he couldn't release as much as he wanted either. This was the most cruel punishment any mage could receive. However, he was incredibly lucky. During his work as a mercenary, he was able to somehow get into the second round. He looked at his damaged hands and thought that he was still a low-grade mage. At that moment, a man in a white robe came into the room where he was standing and said that the registration for temporary work was over for that day. He added that those who had not yet completed the procedure could come back the next day. People started to get angry and said that they had been waiting all day and now they did not know what to do. Someone said that the poor never have to choose. Raymond was sitting against the wall with his head bowed when he heard someone say that the museum was supposedly inviting magicians for a while. These people said that they seemed to be looking for only first-round janitors. They said that they didn't even want to embarrass themselves at something like this. Russell continued to sit against the wall, exhaling heavily. He put his hand in his pocket, looking for something, and then pulled out a small bag with his money. He decided that he would go there. The guy found himself in front of a large museum, the Louvre. The man inside said that their museum was the largest in the whole kingdom. He added that this week they were even going to have aristocrats visiting. That's why everything inside should be sparkling clean. Russell bowed his head and listened to the man. He added that they had to control the wind well while they were cleaning, so that nothing would be broken by their fault. After all, they would have to take full responsibility for it. Russell thought that all these exhibits were probably not original anyway, and that he was just being dramatic. He was following everyone else when something caught his eye. He looked up at the dark door and thought that it looked too familiar for some reason. The room was labeled as the Hall of Fantastic Creatures. He read the sign and thought about it, but at that moment he felt his pocket vibrate. He didn't understand why, but he took out his ring and realized that it was the source of the sound. For some reason, unknown to him, his mother's ring reacted to this door. He looked at it once more, thinking that his feet were leading him to an unknown place, as if fate itself was pulling him there. He opened the door and simply walked into the room, and the man who had been leading them for only a short time noticed and asked where one of the new employees had disappeared. He started to call out to him, but Russell was already standing in the hall in front of the skeleton of some creature, and the vibration from his mother's ring was only getting stronger. He held the ring in his hand and did not understand what it wanted. He asked the ring what it wanted. He remembered how in this hall, near the same skeleton, he was laughing next to his mother, holding her hand. He was also able to recall a direction behind the wall. As if waking up from a trance, Russell opened his eyes abruptly and moved to the place he had just remembered being. There he saw one of the exhibits, covered with glass. It was labeled as the heart of an ancient dragon. He looked at this heart and at the ring that looked suspiciously like a dragon's eye. Russell began to put the ring on and wondered why she was crying and why she had brought him there. As soon as the ring was on his finger, the vibration stopped abruptly, and some strange energy emanated from the heart and skeleton. Russell thought that he was probably just imagining things and that everything was fine, but suddenly his hand was enveloped in red lightning, and a strong charge of power went through the ring. The heart and the eye of the dragon connected. A golden dragon appeared in front of him, and said that this was what allowed him to open the second eye. He told Russell that he would be the first brick in the foundation of a new mythology. He told Russell, who was mesmerized by the sight, that he was giving him another chance for the good of all magic. Russell thought that at that moment he abruptly realized everything. The mechanism that had been turning the world just stopped abruptly, and that long-awaited fate had finally come. The divine eye of the Dragon King began to check the information about this world, and activated the system window and Victor Russell's mission. He heard a very muffled, angry voice, and did not understand whose it was, where it was coming from. He recognized it. It was his teacher. The boy woke up from his dream from a strong blow of a book on his head. He immediately got up from his seat and saw the teacher right in front of his face. The teacher angrily said that he knew, of course, that the boy had very good grades, but he had never allowed anyone to sleep in class before. At that moment, Russell, with a lump on his head, could not understand what was happening and just looked at the teacher. Professor Hubert was standing in front of him, but he was supposed to be dead. He began to quickly look around the classroom, at everyone around him. Everyone was looking at him, and he didn't understand what was happening. Russell decided to put his face in his hands just in case, at which point he realized that he had probably just gone back in time. He was completely surprised and stunned by what had happened to him. He did not understand how he had gotten to the past at all. The teacher told the boy that this behavior was not like him at all, but he would still come up with a punishment for sleeping right in class. He told him to get out of the classroom, and Raymond ran out without hesitation. He didn't understand what had caused the time travel, and whether it could even be called magic. He remembered the moment when the dragon awoke and said that he was giving him a second chance. Russell remembered his words well. At that moment, he looked at his finger and realized that there was no ring on it. He wondered if it was his mom who had helped him so much. At that moment, the professor came out of the classroom and addressed him, saying that he had never fallen asleep in class before. Russell just bowed his head and said he apologized for his behavior. Professor Hubert said that they would need to talk, just the two of them, and told him to come to his office during lunch. Russell replied without looking up that he understood his teacher. Professor Hubert went about his business and said he would wait for Russell. The boy blushed and thought that he didn't even know when he started to get into such trouble, but he still kind of liked it. He looked after the teacher who had already left him. At that moment, he heard someone shouting to him and immediately fell down because he was pushed at the same time. He turned back and asked what idiot dared to do that. There were 3 tall guys standing behind him. One of them took a swing at him and said that he was taking too much liberties. However, another of them stopped him and caught him by the arm, saying that the professors were watching them. The same guy said that he had told Russell to take notes for him, but that he seemed to have passed out in class. Russell looked at him and remembered that his name was Coma Frederick. He told Russell that if he didn't want to die so early, he should go to the bathroom quickly. The 3 boys walked away from him, and he looked at their backs and remembered that this had happened to him before. However, something distracted his attention, and he saw a strange program window in front of him. There was an inscription on it saying that he shouldn't let bullying happen to him and should show his classmates who were insulting him their place. He wanted to try to touch the screen, but it felt like water, and he thought it might be some kind of illusion. However, he quickly realized that it was real, but his classmates had already started shouting whether he was finally following them or just standing there. Frederick turned around and said that it would be absolutely pointless to run because they were at the academy. However, he smiled evilly and added that if he was really scared, he could try. Russell thought about it, but realized that the mission was not so important now, because he was going to teach them a lesson right now. He thought that after a few years of being a mercenary, he could definitely say that their fun and games were absolutely nothing compared to the bloodlust and death of the monsters he had to fight repeatedly. He understood that the children wanted to play. Frederick, with a pipe in his hand, asked if he had finally decided to approach them. Russell was not afraid and said he had guessed right. Another classmate called him crazy. Russell looked at him, but he started swinging his fist again and said that it looked like Russell was just dreaming of getting beat up. However, when the other boy's fist came at Russell, he dodged and ended up on the side of the classmate, punching him in the stomach so that he flew away from his friends. The other boy saw this and wanted to call Russell names, but was interrupted by his own fist, which hit him in the face. 2 guys were already lying on the ground, and Frederick smiled. He said that since he didn't know how to use magic, he decided to learn cheap fighting tricks. Frederick threw away his pipe and said that this was exactly what was expected of an orphan of a fallen family. He added that it was forbidden to use magic in full within the walls, but he thought that someone didn't know that using small artifacts was not punishable at all. He swung at the protagonist and shouted at him to die, calling him a mama's boy. Russell stood still, easily catching his classmate's fist with his hand. Frederick was surprised, but at the same moment Russell simply twisted his fist in the other direction. Frederick fell to his knees in front of him, bent over in pain, and Russell said that everyone knew that he had been demoted by his own brothers. Even his family no longer hopes for a bum like him. Russell said that if the opponent is strong, he is careful, and if he is weak, he just insults him. Russell got so angry that his eyes became like a dragon's. He asked his classmate how a trash like him dared to mention his family. Frederick was frightened and asked Russell to stop, but he had already taken a swing, and it was too late. He hit him right in the face. As he was leaving the restroom, leaving his beaten classmates there, he told them to try to be good boys, unless they wanted to die. Russell walked out and sat down against the wall, covering his face with his hand. He wondered if he had gone too far in punishing his classmates. He closed his eyes and thought he was tired, when the same small screen appeared in front of him, with the inscription about the low-level magic stone. A red stone fell into his hand, right into his palm, and the system informed him that he could eat it. Russell was terrified looking at the sharp piece. He thought that it was certainly edible, but he didn't want to think about having to swallow it. He thought that even the earliest people did not use rocks as food. Nevertheless, he decided that it couldn't be worse and pulled the stone into his mouth. He received a notification that the magic stone had been absorbed. Russell thought that perhaps it was possible, just like his unexpected return to the past. Russell suddenly felt a strange energy tearing through his body from the inside. He didn't understand what was happening, but it turned out that he had gained mana with the help of a magic stone. Russell clutched his chest, feeling the power literally overwhelm him. His circle of mana was rapidly expanding. His heart felt as if it were enveloped in fire. Soon enough, Russell began to calm down and realized that, fortunately, his condition was beginning to stabilize. He realized that with this success, he would be able to expand and strengthen his mana veins. The downfall of his noble family, his expulsion from the academy, and his work as a third-rate mercenary. He really thought he could finally change his difficult fate. After that, Russell went to the professor's office. He walked in and the man asked him to sit across from him. He said that Russell was different that day, not the same as usual. He asked the boy if he might be having some problems or difficulties in his life. Russell was shocked. The teacher went on to say that he had found out that Russell's classmates were bullying him. Russell thought that before, this Professor Hubert was one of the only people who hadn't lost faith in him. He had always wanted to say that, but finally he was able to. He told the man that he had nothing to worry about. He also thanked the professor. Professor Hubert said that as a teacher, he should think about the welfare of his students first and foremost. However, he still needed to punish the boy for sleeping so openly in his class. He said that it would not be easy and asked him to write a summary of the material from the book on enhanced magic. He handed him the book and told him that even high school students couldn't handle such a task. Russell saw the blue screen again, and then realized that even such a small task was considered a mission. Russell looked at his book, and the professor looked at him with a smile, asking if the task was too difficult for him. Russell denied it and thanked him. Later, he sat in his room, stretching in his chair. Russell thought that everything was much easier and simpler than he had expected. Even as a mercenary, Russell never stopped working on the theory to somehow compensate for his perceived magical abilities. There is something in this life that is just as important. He had to learn to control mana. The vessels through which it flows are part of the organ system that is responsible for the circulation of mana in the body. Mana, which is absorbed as we breathe, circulates throughout the body and collects in the heart. Russell was attacked by a monster that was swinging at him, but with the help of mana, he fired back at it. This is called recoil, and Russell used the first round of mana, fire. In other words, the stronger the mana in the vessels, the more of it will enter the heart. This is followed by the fact that it spills out faster into the outside world. However, even after that, the monster continued to advance on him, and Russell wanted to use a shield against it. However, as soon as he managed to turn around, the huge scorpion threw him right into the collapsed column. It so happened that he always had rather weak energy. At that moment, the wall behind him broke and fell in with him. He didn't know if it was the heavens finally hearing him, or if it was just his luck, but he fell in some strange place. He looked around. The historical origin of this place is completely unknown, but there were 2 grimoires hidden in it. They blinded the guy, but he reached out to them anyway. They were called Through the Veins and The Body of a Magician. When he took them in his hands, even more light was released. These were all memories from his former future, and now he knew the contents of these books, and knew that they told him how to train his physical condition and expand his mana vessels. They also told him how to replace muscle tissue with them. This means that the stronger your body becomes, the stronger your mana vessels become. An adult's body doesn't go through as many changes as a teenager's body, which is still growing, so they feel everything much more acutely. Russell told himself that this time he would definitely be able to overcome the narrowing of the mana vessels. After a while, he leaned against a tree and said he couldn't do it anymore. He wiped his forehead wearily, fuming that this would be enough for the day. Then he received a notification that he had to run 5 kilometers for his training, but he had only run half a kilometer. He looked at the screen in disappointment and wondered why they hadn't told him this before. He was also told that he could complete his mission an unlimited number of times during the Through the Veins practice. Depending on his proficiency and progress, the length of the run would gradually change, and when he reached a certain level of proficiency, his mission would disappear altogether. Russell was scared and wondered where this thing was going in such a hurry. He said he would run right now. Russell thought that he had been given this opportunity, so he was not going to sit back and do nothing. He went for his run, and by the end of it, he was barely moving. He had run almost everything he needed to, so he told himself that he only needed to make one last push for the day. Russell lay on the ground and looked at the screen, tiredly realizing that he could not take another step. However, Frederick was watching him from behind a column, and he said to himself that Russell was trying in vain. Later that day, Russell came to the teacher to give him the assignment he was supposed to do as a punishment for sleeping in class. The professor couldn't believe that Russell had written it himself and come to that conclusion. This requires the use of academic-level materials. He asked Russell if he had written the report himself. Russell, who was standing in front of the desk, said that he had indeed written it himself and could swear on money to prove it. The teacher thought that if he was talking about swearing on money, he was being presumptuous. He thought that not everyone would say such serious things so freely. He smiled and said that he liked Russell's work very much anyway. Russell had another flashback to the message, after which he realized that the higher his level of understanding, the stronger he was. The professor told him he was free to leave, but Russell interrupted him and asked him for a favor. After that, the teacher asked him why he wanted access to the school's academy. He said that the library should meet his needs. The boy replied that he had already read everything himself. The teacher was surprised and asked if this was true, and then added that it was really impressive. He said that even if Russell was telling the truth, using the department's library was a problematic issue. They need to see if he is competent enough to do it. Russell got excited and said he understood, and then he saw the assignment messages from Professor Hubert. There were a lot of them. Russell stood by the tree with a towel around his neck and the thought that he had not expected so many assignments. However, as expected, his teacher was very picky. He also reminded himself that the better he knew the theory, the stronger his magic would become. He just needed to reach a high level at any cost. He opened a bottle of water to drink and thought that this could all be a very difficult test for him. But if he gets mana stones for completing tasks, he is now killing 2 birds with 1 stone. At that moment, he heard someone calling his name and looked up to see his classmate Frederick. The classmate told Russell that he had heard that he had been punished with a mana load, but that he was just obsessed with training. He added that his friend had to suffer because of him. Russell asked Anton Frederick why he came to him and whether he wanted revenge. Frederick laughed and said he was not seeking revenge. He told Russell to stop amusing himself, because no one would be interested in taking revenge on a useless fool like him. It would be enough to just trample him into the dirt. Frederick pushed him with his shoulder and said with a disgusted smile that they would see each other in class. As they walked away, one of his friends asked if he wasn't going to finally deal with him, but Frederick said he wasn't going to do it now because there was no audience around. Russell thought about the lesson. It was a lesson in magic combat, a class in which students are matched with an opponent of equal strength. It was a lesson where he had always been humiliated. He simply could not believe that he had forgotten that it was there, that he had been bullied before. Russell thought he needed to be well prepared for this lesson. The notification told him to move on to the second round, and to do so, he needed to increase his understanding of the subjects he already knew. Russell wrote notes endlessly, tiring himself to the point of exhaustion. He brought whole mountains of papers to Professor Hubert for review, which surprised him every time. After that, he finally received a notification that his mission was accomplished, and he could receive his well-deserved reward. In the evening, in his room, Russell laid out all his mana stones in front of him, and thought that now they should be enough. He reached out to touch them, but wondered if he could even withstand such a heavy load. He exhaled and decided that he had no choice but to rely on the results of his constant training. At first, everything was calm, but then energy enveloped his body. His eyes glowed, as did his whole body. He felt like his body was literally on fire. He thought that he urgently needed to continue his journey. He had to give the excess mana a proper form. He gritted his teeth and concentrated the mana in his hand, remembering that he needed to return it and draw a new circle. He knew that if he made a mistake now, his heart would break. However, he had already made up his mind. Russell closed his eyes and began to perform the ritual to open the second circle. He told himself that no matter what, this power would be his. A huge and strong beam of light burst out of the window of his room, which appeared due to the amount of mana. He felt that he had succeeded in opening the second circle and was sincerely surprised, losing his strength and falling to the floor. The message that appeared in front of him informed him that he had successfully completed his task. The next day, Russell stood in the professor's office and told him everything he had learned. Professor Hubert said that it was incredible, and he could not believe that Russell had learned and done it all. He said that in that case, he had one last question for him. Hubert thought that this was the most difficult question he had ever asked, and it would also get him closer to the truth. He asked Russell which of the 4 stages of using magic was the most important. Russell looked at him, but the teacher realized his mistake. He asked a question that he had just recently discussed with a student. He got up from his seat and told him to wait, that he had asked something else. Russell wanted to say the answer, which surprised the teacher. How could he possibly know the right answer? Russell told him that the main part is imagination. The teacher asked him why he thought so, and Russell replied that it appears in the real world with the help of mana. People recognize 4 stages of its use. The first is understanding, which leads to theoretical learning. The second is imagination, which means visualizing what you are studying. Next comes the construction to realize what he visualized. And finally, there is the manifestation, when the magic is revived in the physical world with the help of a formula. All these stages can be achieved only if you put in the necessary effort and study, but at the stage of imagination, because effort won't help there no matter how hard you try. Going beyond the mind and achieving true freedom through courage is what is really important. If he imagines that fire is an arrow, he will become a fire arrow of the second circle of magic. If he begins to imagine something else, it will immediately change its appearance. If he does not define the boundaries of his imaginary visualization, he can even create something that may not even exist in their world. The professor looked at the light in the boy's hand and thought that it was just like the shadow that appears where the sun shines, or the same hot ice. It all starts with understanding the laws of this world and ends with controlling them. This is what real magic is all about. Russell looked at the teacher, and the teacher told him that, just as he thought, the student library was too small for him. Russell received a message about the task and a reward for it. After that, he went to the library, but decided to just look around first. He thought that the first floor itself was very large. Everything in this place was different from the student library, at least the books he noticed on the tables. He saw a book he was interested in, and sat down to open it. A woman appeared behind him, and said that he was holding a very interesting book. Russell was frightened and turned around, not understanding where he was being spoken to. The woman standing behind him called out to him again. Raymond recognized the woman as Daria's Snow White. He stood up and bowed his head to her, saying that he was very pleased to meet her. He introduced himself by looking at the woman. She was one of the few people on this planet who had been able to open the eighth circle. This woman is currently 80 years old, so she uses a very impressive amount of mana to maintain her appearance as a young woman. Her magic tower is the best in the Red Tower faction. She is a fire tower master. Daria said she was pleasantly surprised that the boyfriend knew her. He thought he didn't understand what she was doing in this place. The woman told him not to be nervous, because she was just his interlocutor who was lucky enough to be there. She held out a lollipop in front of him, and he was pleasantly surprised and asked if it was for him. As Raymond was leaving with the candy in his mouth, Daria asked him how the student had managed to get into the professor's library in the first place. Russell did not hesitate to tell her the truth, that he had been allowed to do so by Professor Hubert. The woman turned to him and asked him if he was sure he was talking about the gloomy man. Russell thought about it, remembering Professor Hubert. At this point the woman said that in that case she understood. After all, he was studying something very interesting. She looked at the boy who was just eating a lollipop and said that he had surprisingly pure mana. His energy was evenly and extremely stably distributed throughout his body. She thought this was extremely rare. Russell was afraid that she had noticed something, but Daria, as if reading his mind, told him not to worry, because she was not there to teach him anything. Raymond bowed his head to her again, thanking her. At that point, she disappeared, only telling him to work hard and strengthen his abilities. Russell was surprised, and even flushed when she was no longer there. When Russell later left the library, he touched the door again, thinking that he had not expected to see Daria Snow White there at all, at least not ever. He noted that her advice had been innocent, but this thought was interrupted by the shouting of classmates behind Russell. One of them asked another if it was Raymond in front of him. He turned back to the group of classmates and heard them saying that he had left the professor's library. They could not understand who Raymond thought he was. One of those who spoke was Frederick. He said he was most likely just sucking up to the teachers. He added that he would not be able to achieve anything with such methods anyway. Frederick was leaving, but told him to keep trying anyway. However, he could not guarantee Russell that it would lead to anything good. A little later, the practical lesson in magic combat began. The first person to be called had to go out on the field and choose his opponent. The teachers usually called someone weaker so that they could choose someone of equal strength. In his past life, Raymond was always called first. He overheard the other students betting that Russell would be called first again, because he had weak veins and it was obvious. Someone yelled at him to pick him this time because he needed a good grade for the semester. Another shouted to ignore him and call him, not someone else. The teacher shouted at them to be quiet and keep quiet, and told them that it was time to choose the first participant. Everyone around them began to laugh, knowing in advance who was going to be called. However, to everyone's great surprise, the professor announced the name of Anton Frederick. No one understood how it happened or why he was chosen. When Frederick missed the professor who announced him, he smiled and thanked him. The professor replied that he could not compare to the help he had received from the Frederick Family's Merchants Association. Russell thought that he knew this would happen. Frederick looked up at him and asked him why he was still sitting in his seat. He told him to come downstairs. When he shouted his name, Russell crossed his arms and looked down calmly. The professor sat with a cup of tea in his hands and told his guest to give him a little more notice before coming over, calling her teacher. Daria sat down across from him and said that there was nothing wrong with that. She added that visiting her student was not such a big deal. She picked up her cup and said that he had allowed a boy named Russell to use the professor's library. The teacher said with an excited face that he had and asked if he had done anything wrong. Daria said no, and added that she hadn't seen anyone so rare and valuable in a long time. The teacher bowed his head, folded his arms, and said she was right. He said that the weakness of the mana vessels that this boy had was a very rare disease. Daria told her student that he was a fool, and he was very surprised, not understanding the reason for this. She said that this child had long ago overcome his problem. Daria looked directly at the professor and said that Russell had already reached the second round. As Russell entered the arena, he looked at the message box. It said that he would be able to use the magic department for winning the magic competition. Russell thought about the fact that only the richest magicians could use it. Having one with him would be extremely useful when he would get magic stones again. His thoughts were interrupted by Frederick, who shouted at him why he stood still. He said that if he wanted to live, he could start begging for mercy. Russell just smiled and asked why he should beg for anything. At that moment, his body lit up with red flames, and he looked directly at Frederick. Anton stepped back and did not understand how this magic was possible. They shouted at him to take their positions and announced the start of the battle. Frederick began to concentrate his power and thought that a magician with weak blood vessels could not have a second round. Frederick unleashed a second round of mana fire on him. Right in front of his face, Russell created a shield that stopped the fire and changed its direction, right in front of him. People could not believe that he created a thin shield and used its beveled side to protect himself from the heat. The professor who called Frederick was shocked and thought that Russell Raymond was hiding his abilities from everyone. Frederick himself was visibly agitated and did not understand how Russell could stand it, because he was beginning to shake. He cursed as his magic weakened. Russell caught this moment and decided it was time to act. He began to form a fire arrow, supporting the shield with his other hand. Removing the shield, he sharply launched the arrow in Frederick's direction. Russell's classmate was surprised to realize that he actually seemed to be able to reach the second circle. We crossed his arms for a shield and tried to block Russell's attack. Frederick did not do it with ease, but he still called Russell a mediocrity. He looked at him, and he was afraid. It was simply impossible to comprehend. Russell had already managed to create a second arrow. Raymond looked like he was out of his mind, and had already launched the second arrow at Frederick. The professor looked excitedly at the arena and thought it was a double throw, but another man next to him said he wasn't sure. It didn't look like a double. Rather, the speed of creating these arrows is so fast that it looks like he is throwing two at once. Frederick, behind his shield, thought that these arrows were all Russell could do. He thought that in this case, he would quickly get rid of this problem. He opened his armor against the second round of mana fire. Russell just smiled as he held the arrow in his hand, thinking that this was what he expected. Frederick thought that if he hit Russell while he was waiting for his mana to run out, he would have victory in his pocket. However, with a simple movement of his hand, Russell made a difference and surprised everyone. Frightened, Frederick realized that he had launched a second round of wind arrow at him. Russell recognized his armor and changed his weapon. All the teachers around him were shocked, asking each other if it was really their Russell. At this time, Frederick could barely withstand Russell's blow and could barely stand on his feet. However, he didn't get a break because Russell appeared in front of him in a second, swinging his fist at his stomach while using magic. Frederick's eyes turned white from the blow. Russell withdrew his hand again and swung, using fire magic, hitting Frederick again. The teacher who had been negotiating with Frederick began to shout that this was magic and that the competition should be stopped immediately. However, Professor Hubert asked why it was not magic. He told them to look at Russell's body. The teacher took a look and realized that he was using his mana as knightly armor. Professor Hubert said he didn't know where he got it from, but somehow he had done it all himself. Russell hit Frederick again with a powerful punch. The boy looked at his classmate, who had already made a dent in the ground. Students and teachers stood up from their seats with their mouths open in surprise. One of the teachers, with fear on his face, did not understand how this was possible, but they were snapped out of their thoughts by Professor Hubert, who asked why they were just standing there. He said that it was time to announce the winner of the fight. At this point, the teacher shouted out that Russell Raymond was the winner. While Russell was still standing in the arena, the teacher ran up to him and told him that he had done a good job and could leave. However, Russell said he was not finished yet. The teacher didn't understand what he meant. Russell said, shocking everyone around him, that if the winner of the fight did not give up, he was allowed to choose his next opponent. He pointed his finger upward, pointing to one of those who had insulted him, and with a terrible smile told him to come down to him. Later, Professor Hubert stood in his office with a cup of tea. Russell had won 14 games in a row. He thought that Daria was very smart after all, because she had seen this guy only once, but she could immediately notice the potential of his mana. Hubert looked into his cup and wondered how Russell was able to grow in his abilities so quickly. At that moment, Russell's magic department was activated, where all his magic rewards were to go from then on. He was getting out of the shower and noticed that he had received something unknown as a reward. He saw a small purple portal in front of him, where he decided to put his hand. He took out a map, and the message said to go to the place marked with a cross, and then the lights would show him the right way. However, there was a warning that he should start this task only when he reached the third round. This alarmed Russell, and he thought about the third circle. Before his rebirth, he had tried to open it a huge number of times, but hadn't been able to achieve any result. He didn't know if he would succeed this time. But to be honest, he didn't even know where the place was. He decided that if he used the information from the books in the professor's library, he might find some clues and information. He found and opened a book about the outer territories of the Kingdom of Endymion. It talked about the coast of the empire. With a nervous expression on his face, he thought that he might find the answer in the book about the notes on the outer sea. He realized that there was nothing anywhere, having gone through mountains of books. He realized that he had wasted a lot of time going nowhere. Russell thought that despite this, at this point, he should focus on how to get to the second round. He realized that last time he had indeed been able to stop the bullying of the people who had offended him, but he was still an outcast and rejected by others. His thoughts were interrupted by Professor Hubert, who put his hand on his shoulder and asked if he would like to come to his office. The professor smiled, and Russell replied with a smile and joy that of course he would. Professor Hubert poured himself a cup of tea and told Russell that summer vacation was about to begin. He asked the boy if he had any plans, and Russell replied that he hadn't made any plans yet. The professor put his tea aside and asked Raymond if he would be interested in joining him and working on a research project. He added that if he did a good job, he could write his name right next to his. The teacher asked Russell what he thought about the offer. Russell picked up the book in front of him, and when he realized what was in it, his eyes opened even wider. The teacher looked at him with a question in his eyes, but Russell held the book close to him and apologized to him, saying that he had forgotten that he actually had plans for the summer. The teacher raised one eyebrow and wondered why he had just told him he would be free. Russell gave him the book and said he would visit the place. Professor Hubert looked at the cover and wondered about the vacation in the Maldives. Russell was riding in a carriage, looking out the window, and breathing in the fresh air, putting his face to the wind. He opened his magic box next to him and took out a single mana stone, thinking that it could satisfy his hunger. The man who was carrying him wiped his forehead with sweat and thought that it was too hot outside. It was simply impossible to bear. However, this heat was coming directly from the carriage, which was engulfed in the mana that was coming out of Russell. The boy closed his eyes and decided that before he got to the Maldives, he had to draw a third lap for himself. At this time, Professor Hubert was sitting in his office, thinking about a strange feeling. He wondered why Russell had gone to the Maldives, but there was probably nothing wrong with it. He thought that she was probably vacationing there right now, too. Daria thought that her hometown was as beautiful as ever. She was lying on a sunbed, under an umbrella, thinking that she didn't even know when she had last taken a break like this. She lifted her cocktail glass to her mouth and thought about how defending the empire and presenting magical studies was really very tiring. Even teaching your own students. She remembered standing in front of a crowd of people and saying that 963 had a special meaning for mages. Everyone around her opened their mouths in surprise. The first number is the end point of a person entering the 9th magic circle. The second symbolizes the end of the 6th circle test, which one must go through to become one of the great magicians. And the third circle is the beginning of a person's journey as an independent and separate magician. She put down her cocktail and wondered if that child was doing well, meaning Russell. She remembered his appearance in the library. Later, the carriage with Russell arrived, and the driver announced the end of the journey. He called out to the boy, but did not understand why he did not come out. Tired, he decided to open the door himself to see why he was not coming out. When he opened the door, he was startled to see Russell. Later, the guy ate like it was the last time, stuffing himself to the brim. He knew that he had spent too much energy trying to calm the raging mana. He remembered how the carriage driver was frightened and tried to wake him up. Nevertheless, Russell did what he had planned. He drank his water and set his cup down loudly on the table, thinking only of the 3rd magic circle. He was thinking about how he had succeeded in the past few months in doing things he could only dream of in his previous life before he was reborn. However, he knew that this was not enough for him. He had to go further. Having reached the 3rd circle, he was about to go on to the task at hand. He looked at the book and thought anxiously that no matter what, he still had to get to the place he had set out for. He heard someone shouting behind him about some kind of excursion, offering it at a big discount that was valid only that day. Legends say that Pompeii used to be just an ordinary mountain, which later became a volcano. This happened only because a special mythical creature appeared in this area. Russell looked at the volcano and thought that the volcano was created by the presence of this creature. He knew that there was only one creature in the world that could do this, and it was none other than the Red Dragon. Russell looked at the performance of the people telling the story and thought that he would rather be there alone. He quickly ducked down and moved in the opposite direction from the others, jumping off the cliff quickly before anyone noticed him. After a while, the group wondered where their other hiker had gone. Russell stood with his feet in the water near the waterfall. He was thinking that the reason he had come back was because of his rapid advancement through completing missions and the rewards he received for doing so. He looked at the waterfall with a map in his hands and a smile on his face. He wondered if it might have something to do with the dragon. He looked at the map and a small golden ball appeared above it, looking like a real light or spark. It quickly moved in front of him, and Russell realized that it was the same light that was supposed to show him the right way and where to go. The spark quickly crossed the waterfall, heading behind him. Russell smiled and thought that he had to follow this light. He concentrated his energy and mana, and used his already known air arrow, thanks to which he was easily able to get into the cave behind the waterfall, ignoring the water. He stood on a protruding stone and thought that there might be a cave with lava. That is why he was not surprised that people did not know anything about this place. He remembered that he had been warned that he should only go here after he had reached the third circle of mana, but for some reason he hadn't seen any monsters or beasts in this place. He stepped forward, looking at one of the columns. He put his hand on it and wondered how old this thing was. Because of a strange sound, he turned back to the darkness. He kept walking, and someone in the darkness thought he was watching him and wondering where he would go, but he chose to go there. Russell was alerted and realized that he had really forgotten his days as a mercenary. Because a situation where there are no monsters or monsters is not safe at all. It only means that he has entered the territory of an extremely strong enemy. Before he could turn around, a Komodo lizard was right in front of his face. It opened its mouth to attack the surprised Russell. Its attack hit one of the columns, which flew in different directions, destroying part of the room. Russell covered himself with mana as a defense and bounced upwards. He frowned and realized that this lizard was a strong monster that could only be defeated by two strong and large teams of mercenaries. He needed to get out of there as fast as possible, because that's all he could do now. He stood right in front of the monster and began to concentrate mana in his hand, turning it into a second-round lightning arrow. The lizard and Russell simultaneously began to attack each other, and Russell launched his arrow straight at its head. At that moment, the monster lit up from the inside. Russell realized that he could only slow it down a little bit with his strike. He started running and realized that he had to get out of there as fast as possible. However, the gate he was running toward closed right in his face, and he felt that in order to get through it, he had to prove it with his mana. Russell was angry and didn't understand what it was, but a monster was already running after him. He turned around and thought that since he couldn't run away, he had to fight the battle anyway. He got angry, and with dark eyes said that he would just deal with it. He touched his hand, which was engulfed in fire, and created a pillar of fire of the second circle of mana. The lizard looked at him, and for some unknown reason stopped. It simply stopped moving, which confused Russell, who was ready to attack. At that very moment, the lizard rose above the guy standing in front of it and fell down in front of him. Russell did not understand what was happening. However, at that very moment the door behind him opened. He heard a voice say that he had proven himself worthy to pass through. Light began to pour out of the stone on the door. A light that completely illuminated Russell. When it disappeared, he rubbed his eyes because the bright light had blinded him. He opened his eyes and touched the ice beneath him, not realizing where he was. He could see the statues of the guards in front of him, which were extremely large. He looked around and thought it must have been some kind of teleportation magic, because just a moment ago he was still in the cave. He got up and saw a red light behind him. Russell turned around and saw something very big and strange behind him. A message appeared in front of him saying that he had to defeat all the ice golems with fire to complete the task. He did not understand who they were, but quickly turned his gaze to the guards around him. He began to realize what was going on as soon as they began to move. The eyes of these creatures glowed red, and Russell simply did not understand how he could defeat them all at once. He activated the fire power on his arm and shouted that such tasks were too much for him. He attacked one of the golems with a wave of fire. The whole golem was covered in flames, and the guy remembered that in order to kill a golem, you need to destroy its core from the inside. However, the one he attacked stood there as if nothing had happened, and only got away with a small scratch. Russell gritted his teeth and wondered what the temperature of this ice must be. He decided that since fire would not work on them, he could try to use the power of the wind. He wanted to create wind in his palm, but he was afraid when he realized that he could not say the spell. The golem rushed at him, and Russell put his hand forward in an attempt to create at least lightning, but it was all in vain. At this point, the golem attacked him with ice, but he fortunately managed to bounce back and avoid the attack. Russell, already wounded, remembered that the messages said that he had to defeat these creatures with the power of fire. At that moment, the golem swung its arm at him again, and Russell realized that he would not be able to use any magic other than fire. He stumbled over a rock and found himself pinned against the wall, as all these golems began to come closer and closer to him, advancing. He held his shoulder in pain, but thought that this was some kind of dubious entertainment for him. He wiped his forehead with his hand and activated a two-circle mana pillar of fire. He looked directly at the ice golems that towered over him with their scary red eyes. He was covered in his fire, but he thought he could handle it alone. He attacked the golem with his fire, but when nothing happened, he immediately repeated his attack, keeping a close eye on his enemy. He stood there holding his arm, which was covered in fire, and thought that there were two more monsters in front of him. He realized that at this rate, his mana would run out before he could kill them all. He was worried, but he thought about how he could find another way to win. Russell decided to run away from the attack of the golem, which punched the ground where Russell had been standing a second ago. He realized that in order to pierce the armor of each of these creatures, he needed to concentrate his power exclusively in one spot. He decided that concentration would be the best solution right now. He thought that first he needed to get away from them, so that he could cast a spell. He decided that after that he would use his fire arrow, along with a formula to strengthen it, and with the summoning of the double fire pillar, he could finally combine all that it would form. Russell saw 5 magical fire arrows in front of him. All of them were transformed into a compression formula. He squeezed all 5 arrows in his hands, using all his strength. The golem was just a step away from him, and he swung his huge arm. Russell shouted for the arrows to shrink faster. He begged them. This was his only chance. At that moment, there was an extremely strong explosion, after which the golem that had swung at him fell in front of the guy with a huge hole in the place where his core had been before. Russell moved away from him, and his eyes turned black again and looked like dragon eyes. This was the moment when Russell's fire spear was created. He looked directly at the golems. He received a message that his understanding of fire magic had become much stronger. He held the spear in his hands and felt its power. Russell thought that this power felt like something that could be close to the fifth circle of mana. He realized that even while he was just holding this spear in his hands, it required a huge amount of his mana. At the same moment, he decided that in this case he would attack first, and rush to the ice golems that were still alive. He did not hesitate, and was not afraid even when they swung at him again. He ran with great speed from one to the other, attacking them one by one. Russell hung in the air with his magic spear in his hands. He landed back on the ground and counted that there were 4 more monsters to overcome. He began to attack them again, breaking their cores. There were 2 more golems left. He took a swing at one, and hoped that he could take them out as quickly as he had the previous ones. Russell sliced one of them in 2 with his spear. He stopped for a second, thinking that there was one more enemy left. The guy just had time to start turning around when he was attacked by the very last monster. Russell grimaced in pain, but realized that if he hadn't blocked the blow with his spear, he would have been dead for sure. He looked at his hands and realized that he had very little mana left. He stood up and decided that this would be his last throw. The golem was only a few meters away, but Russell was just praying to all the gods that this spear would fly at least one last time. At that moment, he realized that he had pierced a hole in the last monster, and he had finally won. His eyes began to close from fatigue, and in a few seconds he fell unconscious in the middle of the hall. He received a notification that he had completed his task and was receiving his reward. One of them was the forgotten horn of the king, which was a fiery object. It turned out that it was the same big red thing that hung in the hall where he fought the golems. The chains that held it loosened and lowered the horn. It burst into a furious flame and glowed, illuminating the unconscious Russell, who was still lying on the ground. The alert said that they had begun to delve into the memories of the forgotten king in order to receive the reward for the task. Russell opened his eyes, tired, but not realizing where he was. He was chained with golden chains in the middle of a space that seemed to be non-existent. He received a notification that he had successfully immersed himself in memories and received his well-deserved reward. Russell didn't understand why the king's horn, because it was supposed to be a fire dragon's horn. He wondered if it could even be called a reward. He had the impression that he was going to be tortured here. He is a man who has passed the fire test and attained the thoughts of a sacred being. Russell was frightened and did not understand why he was hearing this at all. He thought his head was going to explode. The same horn appeared in front of him, and the voice said that it was giving it to him.